The Nickelodeon Slimecast podcast is brought to you by the Re-Open Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida Facebook page, and is produced by Patricia Miranda from oldschoollane.blogspot.com. Welcome to a very special themed month of podcast discussing about the 3 original Nicktoons. I am Patricia, and I'm here with Admin James.
Here.
The first one we're going to be discussing about is Doug. So, right before we dive deep really into it, what is your earliest memory of Doug?
Sometime in the 90s, I remember watching it for the first time, and believe it or not, this is actually a true story. I didn't think that the show was called Doug when I was a kid. I used to think it was called Dog, and I used to think that it was about pork chop.
Really? That's a really interesting story.
I thought that Doug was just his owner. Well, he is, but you get the picture.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. All right. As for my earliest memory, I do remember seeing, a handful of episodes of Doug. I can't remember what my first episode was, but I do remember the earlier seasons of Doug when I was a young kid, maybe when I was around like 6 or 7 years old. I would say maybe around the early 90s. I remember that later on, my best friend Kevin, who was a huge fan of Doug, would get me more and more into the show, and then we started talking about it whenever we were in class. So, that's pretty much my story, and I'm sure I'll get more into it later. So, now let's discuss about some of our favorite moments of Doug, like our favorite episodes, who our favorite characters are, and what Doug left behind when it came to animation. So, James, what are your favorite episodes of Doug?
I like the episode where they win tickets to see the Beats live, and what else? I haven't seen it in a while, but I do enjoy it. I do enjoy that one.
Yeah, definitely some of the best episodes of the entire series for Doug was with anything involving with the Beats. Like you were saying before, the episode where we were first introduced to the Beats, where Skeeter first introduces to Doug about the band, and then they start winning tickets for the Beats, and then Skeeter gets grounded because he's making too much noise in the dining room table. And then there's the episode in which they get 2 tickets, and then they have to go on a bus all the way to Bloatsburg for the concert, and then some bad stuff happens, like, they missed the bus, and then they left the tickets at the diner. And
that's what happens.
Yeah, because there's 2 instances in which they won tickets for the Beats. The first one was, they won the tickets, and then Skeeter got grounded, and then the other one was where they made the road trip to Bloatsburg, and then a whole bunch of stuff happened.
The one that I was talking about was the road trip one.
Oh, okay, yeah. And then there's other episodes, like the episode in which Mr. Bone forbids the school for inviting the Beats over for a concert, and he wants to invite his yodeling group. And then Doug makes a compromise in which both the yodeling group and the Beats can come in, and then we have that song "I Need More Allowance," which kind of fuses in their rock music with a little bit of yodeling in it.
Gotta love the music in this show.
Oh yeah, definitely. We'll get into the other music in a minute, but the Beats, the 3 songs that they're known for is Killer Tofu, I Need More Allowance, and Shout Your Lungs Out. And last year for Christmas, I bought my friend Kevin a Beats t-shirt that says Beats on Tour, and he really liked it. And I also gave him the complete series of Doug. So, and then of course there's a lot of the music that's playing done by Fred Newman and Dan Sawyer. Fred Newman, who does a lot of the sound effects for the show, and he's the voice of Skeeter and Mr. Dink and Pork Chop. And then Dan Sawyer, who's the one who does... Yeah, exactly. Hong Kong. And then Dan Sawyer does the guitar, and he does a lot of the instrumentals as well. So, who are your favorite characters?
Roger.
Roger.
He's hilarious. He's a fun prankster, but I don't think he's truly mean. I think he's got a heart, but I don't think he's really that much of a bully, rather than just somebody just pulls pranks on people.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, Roger always seems like the kind of character who feels like he needs to push people around so he can feel important, but I don't think he really means everything that he does. He's just trying to make himself look cool and hold a reputation. And, yeah, I think that, there's some episodes featuring Roger in which you kind of feel bad for the guy. Like, there's the episode in which you have the bumper sticker competition, and there's a mystery to who stole the bumpers, and it turned out to be Roger because he was feeling jealous of everybody around who got to participate in the wheelbarrow race with their dads, and Roger's dad wasn't around.
Yeah, I've always felt as a kid that Roger was just basically misunderstood and decided to just basically pull jokes on people to make him feel less guilty about his life.
Yeah. Anybody else that you feel?
Doug himself, obviously. He's really likable. One of the problems I have with the show is that I don't feel Doug has that much of a personality. I know that he's supposed to be based off the creator. No offense to him. I don't mean him, but I mean I don't mean Jim Jenkins, but it seems that although that Doug is a nice guy, he's harmless, he just seems like an everyman rather than actually having an actual personality until the end of the Nickelodeon series.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, even though that I kind of was a little harsh when I said that he's the average, boring, bland character, I meant to say he's more of a blank slate, in which, like, everybody can be able to put themselves into Doug's situation, because Doug is enough of a person that can be relatable, but at the same time, he doesn't have a lot of standout personalities that can make him a true character. I mean, don't get me wrong, Doug is a very iconic character, but not really much so in which is a memorable one. I mean, he does go through his issues, he does go through his struggles, and he does have problems, he does have his ups and downs, but it's not as complex. And with Doug, he's not one of my favorite Nicktoons characters. I think that, a lot of the other characters in Doug are some of my favorites because they're so up there with their personality, but not with Doug. And again, this is based off of Jim Jenkins when he was a kid. Nothing wrong about that. I completely understand. I mean, it's very similar to how Charles Schultz created Charlie Brown.
Jim is a very nice guy, and yeah, and I didn't really mean that statement about Doug to be against him. It's just how he's written.
Oh, yeah, it's totally fair, considering that that's what the whole point was. The whole point was to have Doug as the everyman so that kids can be able to relate to him. And the interesting thing to know, that's kind of what Nickelodeon didn't want originally. They didn't want to have Doug featuring a whole bunch of life lessons.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, Doug is very important because of that, because kids were able to relate to him. And this was during a time in which slice-of-life cartoons were pretty much non-existent. With the only exception of maybe being Charlie Brown and the Snoopy Show, there really weren't a lot of slice-of-life cartoons that we have today.
And Rugrats coincided with that as it aired on the same day, and that's a slice-of-life show too, if you take out the element that the babies can actually talk.
Fair enough, but I would count more Doug because with Rugrats is able to, have the perspectiveness of a baby. And even though that a baby, it doesn't really have much to expand with the stories, with the exception of maybe like, oh, they've never seen an object and they want to find out what it is, or there's some sort of event going on, or they think that an item is real or something. With Doug, it's a little bit more straightforward because it's based off of a kid, and kids would actually be watching the show and they would see issues like school and bullies and homework and crushes, best friends, stuff like that. Let me tell you some of my favorite characters. One of my favorite characters is Judy. I really love how overdramatic she is. Like, constantly being infatuated with Shakespeare, definitely representing the beatnik era of the 90s, in which is all about poetry, and also being like a massive thespian, talking about plays and stuff like that, and always having her sunglasses on with her beret, and the one episode in which when Doug first imagines what Judy will be like when Judy decides to perform at his school. I just find it to be really hilarious, having her bongos and just having this huge dramatic poem, and in which, you know, she's like, what was it again? It's like, you know, I am your washing machine. Oh, pink underwear. Then she concludes it with, Doug loves petting. And, you know, Doug just imagines, like, this is going to be the worst thing ever. And, you know, Judy, for me, was, like, always a major highlight in a lot of episodes. And it's a shame that the spin-off series never happened.
Wait, there was supposed to be a spin-off series?
Well, for the Disney iteration, anyway. I had Jim over on my podcast almost 2 years ago, and he told me that they were planning on doing a spin-off series called Judy, 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 but then, long story short, it didn't work out. Which, I guess it's understandable.
Let me guess, it's because of how Disney's Doug eventually came to an end.
I think that was one of the reasons, yeah. I also love Skeeter. I love how energetic he is, and I love the way that he does his crazy, goofy sound effects, and even though that he's supposed to be a genius, according to the episode in which they were testing his IQ, and he turns out to be, like, a massive genius, he's always, like, this goofy kid who always has his head in the clouds, and he's not very good with common sense, and he's very, very loyal to Doug. Skeeter is based off of Jim's old childhood friend, whose name was Tom. And, yeah, apparently with Skeeter, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people, some people actually know this, but despite having blue skin, Skeeter is supposed to represent an African American.
I think he's pretty likable. He reminds me of an old friend that I used to have. Unfortunately, that friendship didn't really work out, as sometimes life does not work out for us, but, you know, but still.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, and let's see who else. I also like Roger as well. Roger's another one of my favorite characters because he's just so over the top, you know, crazy with his bullying, but at the same time he does have a good heart. Let me see if there's anybody else. Then there's Mr. Dink. You know, Mr. Dink is always like the goofy neighbor who always buys things that are very expensive. Yeah.
Want to shag some balls?
Exactly. And, yeah, and apparently, according to an interview, Dink is actually an acronym. It stands for Double Income No Kids. So I guess that's where all the money comes from. The fact that, you know, in the Nickelodeon version, Mr. and Mrs. Dink don't have kids. Other episodes that I really do enjoy from Doug, now that watching it again, the episodes focusing on Quail Man. I really like the episodes with Quail Man because it's able to play in a lot of the imaginations from Doug.
That and the beats are easily, in my opinion, the best part about the show. I love the Quail Man fantasies.
Yeah. The two episodes of Quail Man that really are my favorites are, it was an episode in which Quail Man versus Robobone, in which Mr. Bone is like in which Robobone goes over to the schools, and they control everything in the school, and they don't let the kids have fun. And then there's the episode in which, Dr. Klotzenstein controls all of Doug's friends using zombie chips, and then the only solution is for everybody to eat beets, which it's funny because I just rewatched the entire series of Doug recently, and for some reason they just have an obsession with beets. I mean, not just the band, I'm talking about like the food, the vegetable itself. I mean, in the Honker Burger, there's like beet shakes, there's a beet festival, there's a lot of beets in this show. I just don't understand what's the appeal of beets to Bluffington.
Beet paradise.
Yes, beet mania. Anyway, so, yeah, that's a very interesting thing that I saw. Let's see, another episode. My friend Kevin's, one of his favorite episodes is Doug Saves Roger, which is the episode in which Mr. Bone's nephew, Percy Femur, haha, get it? Femur, bone. Anyway, So he's like a big bully to Roger, and he constantly picks on him. And so Doug decides to stand up to Percy's to defend Roger, and then Percy is going to beat up Doug, and then Roger calls in Mr. Bone, and then it shows cases like this is one of the very few times in which Doug and Roger can actually work together. And then, there's like the episode in which Doug is embarrassingly going over to a TV studio where his aunt works, and the TV show that he happened to be on for that one day happens to be a baby show featuring a cowboy with a clown, and he has to rope a pig or something like that, and he gets embarrassed, and then Roger sees it, and then he records it on VHS tape, and he's going to show it to everybody. Nowadays, I'm sure that they'll be on DVR, and you can record it and probably put it up on YouTube or something. But then the plot twist is that Roger was in the same TV show the year prior, a bit of relief after being embarrassed himself with him being on the TV show. And let's see. There's a lot of episodes. And, there's a lot of characters that we can go on and on about, discussing about. So let's just wrap things up with talking about, two things. What do you think Doug left behind when it came to animation?
Well, I think it opened the door for a lot more slice-of-life cartoons that followed a structure to it and, did their own take on it, being able to tell their own stories of their own childhoods, which basically, alongside more cartoony cartoons, pretty much summed up the entire 90s animation renaissance.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, in the early 90s, every single cartoon wanted to be either three things. They wanted to be like Batman the Animated Series, they wanted to be like The Simpsons, or they wanted to be like the Ren and Stimpy Show. With Doug, it didn't really gain a really big, massive appreciation until the late 90s, in which more slice-of-life cartoons started coming out, especially around with Nickelodeon and Disney.
Didn't Rugrats have a similar thing? Yeah, except even bigger.
Well, we'll talk about that in the next episode. But yes, for the most part, when Nickelodeon revived Rugrats around the late 90s, that was during the golden era of the slice of life cartoons. So you had the revival of Rugrats, you had Hey Arnold, you had Recess, Fillmore, Pepper Ann, a whole bunch of others. I think that with Doug, it definitely paved the way for that. And it's kind of funny that, a lot of people nowadays that I've been seeing, they've been dissing Doug a lot. They say that it's just a bland and boring show that doesn't hold up and that, it's not really recommended to check out, which I guess, when you compare it to the other slice of life cartoons, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, to be quite honest, the majority of the characters are... Well, I mean, they are, stereotypes. You have Chalky, who's the stereotypical jock. Alan Moo are the stereotypical geniuses. And BB is the stereotypical rich, snobby girl, and so on and so forth. I get that, but I think because Doug left a massive impact on a lot of people, and I think there are some episodes of Doug that hold up really well.
I have to admit something about Doug.
Go ahead.
It's not my favorite show, but I would watch it if I was bored. It's not the worst I've seen, but I prefer the other two Nicktoons more. That's just my opinion.
You're perfectly fine with your opinion, James, and I'm not holding you against it. And, to be fair, I basically agree just as well. Out of the three original Nicktoons, Doug doesn't hold up as well as Rugrats or the Ren and Stimpy Show. And, when looking at all the other cartoons that came out after Doug, with the slice of life aspect, it does feel a bit lackluster. But considering that this was one of the first that did it since, like, Charlie Brown and the Snoopy Show, and there are still some episodes that hold up. Like, one that I was very surprised at was an episode called Doug's Cartoon, in which Doug is furious at this Salisbury steak meat called Magic Meat, and he decides to draw a cartoon saying, this is what magic meat is, and he compares it to like a wig and a hockey puck and stuff like that, and Mr. Bone gets furious. So furious in which he decides to cancel the papers because Doug was stating an opinion of how he felt about it, and Mr. Bone didn't like the opinion, so he called off the school papers, and everybody's going to, everybody's saying like, hey, let's go against Mr. Bone, and let's see if we can be able to draw these, we can release the cartoon that Bone didn't want you to see, and then Judy's classmates come in and help with a protest and stuff like that. It's like, that's kind of like a precursor to what would it be like in the internet if there was a disagreement or something, or if they want to do a petition on something and they're going up against somebody or whatever. It's like, that's actually pretty interesting to look at. But other than that, I do understand that not all people like Doug. And you know what, you're perfectly fine with it if you don't like it. If you think it's boring, I understand. But I do think that there are some things redeemable to Doug. And I'm not going to say Doug is the best Nicktoon. It's not, to be quite honest. It probably wouldn't even be in my top 5. But for what it did for the original Nicktoons lineup, for what it did for animation, I do respect it as a whole. Now, right before we concluded, I'd like to know from your personal opinion, because last year in Nick's Missile 2, we talked about Disney's Doug. Now, what are your opinions on Disney's Doug?
I don't get why people criticize it so much. I mean, like, it's not that different from the original. But out of the two, I'd rather watch the Nick Dog. But I do understand where some of the criticisms for the Disney's Dog come from, but when you compare the two, they're not really that different, except it's on a different network and the characters are older and some of the music's changed.
And Billy West isn't doing the voice of Doug.
Oh yeah, that as well.
Yeah, and Roger as well. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I've already discussed about Disney's Doug and Nick's Missile 2, and I'll do an entire video on it in the later this month about if Disney's Doug is really that bad on my personal YouTube channel. But going back to the Nickelodeon Doug, if you've never seen Doug and you would I recommend that you check it out? Yes, I would. I would recommend that you check it out. But if you're disappointed by it, that's saying like, oh, Doug is a classic, Doug is like one of the best shows ever, and you don't think so, then you know what? I think that maybe for the most part, because you were surrounded by a whole bunch of other cartoons that did the same thing that Doug did, but much earlier, it's kind of a little hard to look back on. I mean, Doug is no Gravity Falls, don't get me wrong, but the point is that Doug was a precursor to what would it be later on, and it should be appreciated for it. And yes, I do recommend that you check it out for a handful of the characters, the music, and some really good episodes. Anyway, so anything else to say about Doug right before we go?
Beats me.
Ha! Beats me. Alright, well that's it for this episode. Tune in next time as we're going to be discussing about the biggest phenomenon out of the 3 Nicktoons, Rugrats. So see you then.
Killer Tofu! Fast food feels fuzzy, 'cause it's made from stuff that's scuzzy. I always thought I was such a nerd, I refused to touch that strange bean curd. I wouldn't eat it, wow, but it ate you. E-I-E-O, killer tofu. E-I-E-O, killer tofu. I eat my sugar cereal, but it makes my teeth back